There is a power Scripture assumes you're using, but most people never touch. Not because it's hidden, not because it's complicated, but because it feels too ordinary to be powerful. You pray for change, you ask God to move, you wait for breakthrough, all while ignoring the one thing God already placed in your hands. And once you see it, you'll realize why so many believers are sincere, yet stuck. Let's go there. Scripture makes a statement that is almost uncomfortable in its clarity. I call heaven and earth as witnesses today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing, therefore choose life. Deuteronomy 30 verse 19. This is not symbolic language, it is legal language. Heaven and earth as witnesses means God is declaring a law, not a suggestion. Witnesses are called when responsibility is being assigned. And notice what God does not say. He does not say, pray and I will decide. He does not say, wait until I move. He does not say, hope I choose correctly for you. He says, I have set it before you. Life and death are already placed. Blessing and cursing are already present. Nothing here is future tense. Nothing here is conditional on God's mood or timing. The only unresolved element is human participation. That means heaven is not undecided. Heaven is not debating outcomes. Heaven has already released the options. The deciding factor is not heaven's willingness. It's your participation. This is where the discomfort comes in. Because it means many of the things people blame on fate, on the devil, on circumstances, or even on God's silence, are actually connected to something Scripture says was already placed in their hands. That means there is a God-given power at work that most people never realize they're meant to exercise. Scripture calls it choice, but not choice as preference, not what do I feel like today, not emotional selection, choice as authority. Let's go deeper. From the beginning, God did something radical. He created humans in His image, and then He gave them dominion. Dominion is not force, it is not coercion, it is not control through pressure. Dominion is authority to decide direction. That's why God does not micromanage humanity. He governs through law, then entrusts humans with stewardship. This is why Scripture repeatedly speaks to the inner world. Choose this day whom you will serve. Set your mind on things above. Guard your heart. Take every thought captive. These are not poetic phrases. They are instructions that assume capacity. None of these commands make sense unless humans actually possess power. God never commands responsibility without granting capacity. And the power Scripture keeps pointing to is not mystical, not emotional, not hidden in some spiritual elite. It is the ability to govern your inner world, what you allow to rule your thoughts, what you permit to shape your expectations, what you normalize emotionally, what you agree with internally. Scripture shows this pattern again and again. Whatever governs the inner world eventually shapes the outer one. That's not motivational language, that's structural reality. So, why do most people never use this power? Because they were taught to wait instead of rule. They were taught that maturity means patience, but not authority. That faith means hoping, but not deciding. That spirituality means surrendering responsibility, not exercising it. So they wait. They wait for motivation to appear. They wait for clarity to arrive. They wait for God to do something. But Scripture never trains believers to wait for internal order. It trains them to establish it. Meanwhile, Scripture keeps pointing inward. Yet most people experience life as if they are being controlled by emotions, thoughts, reactions, circumstances. They don't decide their responses. They discover them after the fact. They don't choose their inner posture. They inherit it from habit. So they assume they are powerless. But Scripture reveals the opposite. You are not controlled. You are untrained. An untrained mind defaults to habit. An untrained heart defaults to fear. An untrained mouth defaults to reaction. And when these defaults run unchecked, people call the result life, when Scripture calls it sleep, bondage, or immaturity. The tragedy is not that people lack power, it's that they never learned they were meant to use it. And until that changes, life keeps happening to them, even though Scripture says it was placed before them. And here's the part that should bother you. If Scripture is right, then the problem isn't that life is too hard. The problem is that something inside you has been running on default for years, untouched. And defaults don't feel like chains. They feel like normal. That's why people stay stuck and call it maturity. They stay bound and call it personality. They stay asleep and call it life. So before I give you the step-by-step, you need to see this clearly. The next breakthrough in your life is not coming from a new opportunity. It's coming from a new government inside you. Because the moment you learn how to use the power Scripture says you already have, certain patterns won't even be able to stay. Now let me show you exactly how to start exercising it, step by step. Step 1. Choose before you feel ready. Most people believe emotions are signals to obey. Scripture treats emotions as conditions to govern. That's why God does not say, feel life. He says, choose life. Choice comes before emotional alignment. This is critical because emotions are reactive by nature. They respond to memory, pressure, chemistry, habit, and environment. If emotions lead, your life will always be reactive. Scripture reverses the order. When God says, therefore choose life. Deuteronomy 30, verse 19. He is establishing jurisdiction. He is saying, you have the authority to decide direction, even when conditions disagree. This is why Joshua echoes it. Choose this day whom you will serve. Joshua 24, verse 15. Joshua does not ask how they feel. He does not wait for consensus. He demands a decision, because decision stabilizes the inner world. This is what most people miss. Choice is not denial of emotion. It is placement above emotion. When you wake up anxious and say, I will not be ruled by fear today, you are not pretending fear doesn't exist. You are assigning it a lower rank. You are saying you may be present, but you will not be in charge. That is governance. And governance always precedes peace. Scripture never promises that feelings will lead correctly. It promises that obedience produces life. That's why choice must come first, because once authority is exercised, emotions eventually follow. Step 2. Set your mind on purpose, not on default. If choice establishes authority, focus establishes direction. This is why Scripture doesn't say, feel your way forward. It says, set your minds on things above. Colossians 3, verse 2. The word set implies intention, placement, fixing something in position. A mind that is not set will drift. And drift always follows the strongest pressure in the moment. That's why Scripture explains the contrast. Those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. Romans 8:5. In other words, whatever you consistently focus on becomes the operating system. Stress is not always caused by problems. It is often caused by unchecked focus. Fear multiplies when attention is left unmanaged. Peace grows when attention is directed. Setting your mind means you decide in advance what gets mental priority. That's why this moment matters. Before the phone, before the news, before the demands. You ask, what truth is governing me today? Because whatever you look at first tends to lead everything else. Scripture understands something psychology confirms. Attention is never neutral. What you repeatedly attend to trains your nervous system, shapes your expectations, and informs your decisions. This is why focus becomes fuel. You don't move toward what you want. You move toward what you consistently think about. So Scripture doesn't say, hope your mind lands in the right place. It says, set it. Because an unset mind lives on default. And default settings are usually fear, scarcity, and past conditioning. But a set mind begins to experience clarity, stability, and restraint. Not because life got easier, but because direction was established. Step 3. Guard your heart like a gate. Scripture is very precise about order. It does not say, guard your circumstances, guard your relationships, guard your finances. It says, guard your heart with all diligence, for out of it flow the issues of life. Proverbs 4, verse 23. That word issues means outflows, boundaries, borders, directions. In other words, life doesn't just happen to the heart, life flows from it. So guarding the heart is not emotional suppression. It is gatekeeping. Your heart is not a container, it is a source. Whatever you allow to circulate there long enough eventually shows up as attitude, decision, and outcome. This is why repetition matters. The heart is trained by what is replayed. If fear is replayed, fear becomes familiar. If disappointment is replayed, disappointment becomes expectation. If offense is replayed, offense becomes identity. And Scripture treats this seriously because the heart does not filter truth on its own. It absorbs what it is fed. So when you keep rehearsing worst-case scenarios, you are not preparing, you are conditioning, you are teaching your inner world. This is normal, this is likely, this is expected. Guarding the heart means interrupting that process early, not after fear has settled, not after anxiety has taken root, at the gate. That's why the question matters. What am I allowing to live rent-free in me? Because whatever is allowed to stay will eventually start directing how you live. Step 4. Take thoughts captive before they become conclusions. Scripture never says thoughts are dangerous because they exist. Thoughts are dangerous because they settle. That's why it says, take every thought captive to obey Christ. 2 Corinthians 10 verse 5. A captive is not entertained. A captive is examined and restrained. This tells us something important. Thoughts are visitors, not authorities. They knock, they suggest, they present narratives, but they only gain power when they are agreed with. Agreement is the true turning point. A thought becomes a belief when you stop questioning it. A belief becomes a conclusion when you start living from it. And conclusions shape identity. That's why Scripture does not say, ignore thoughts, analyze thoughts endlessly, fight thoughts emotionally. It says, take them captive. That means you stop them at the door and ask, is this true? Is this from God? Does this align with what He has said? Example of a thought. Nothing will ever change. If that thought is allowed to settle, it becomes resignation, then passivity, then hopelessness. But captivity sounds different. That is not truth. That is familiarity. You name it for what it is, a pattern, a memory, a learned expectation, not reality. Then you replace it with truth. God is at work. Change is possible. This is not final. Because Scripture shows, thoughts do not need to be powerful. They need to be unchallenged, and once you challenge them consistently, they stop presenting themselves with authority. This is where awakening becomes practical. You stop living from unconscious conclusions and start living from intentional truth, not forcefully, not emotionally, but decisively. And that's when the inner world starts changing, which is always where change begins. So, this is what I want you to know. God did not withhold power from you. He placed it within you and expected you to use it, not to control others, not to force outcomes, but to govern yourself, and once you do, life stops running you. So here's the question that matters. What are you allowing that you were actually meant to rule? If this landed, type this in the comments. I choose deliberately, because the moment you realize you were never powerless, everything changes.